HOA President versus Wealthy Bully, Part 1 of 4. This wealthy businessman destroyed my trash can 43 times with his $75,000 Range Rover, so I replaced it with a reinforced concrete version and watched him wreck his own luxury vehicle instead. What began as systematic property destruction ended with felony charges, a $15,000 settlement, and one incredibly expensive lesson about choosing the wrong HOA president to bully. Imagine this. The harsh sound of plastic exploding shatters the peaceful Arizona sunrise, followed by the distinctive roar of a British engine as a silver Range Rover speeds away, leaving my garbage strewn across the desert landscape like tumbleweeds. But here's something about entitled bullies. They never anticipate their targets fighting back with literal concrete solutions. By the time everything concluded, this self-important tech executive had demolished his own prestigious vehicle, revealed a $38,000 kickback scheme with contractors, and discovered the painful truth that some HOA presidents absolutely refuse: intimidation from expensive vehicles and manufactured grievances. Seriously, what would your response be if your neighbor essentially treated your property like target practice every single morning? Leave a comment and share where you're tuning in from. I'm curious whether this type of neighborhood insanity exists in your community too. Let me rewind and explain how this entire catastrophe started. My name is Barbara Chen. I'm 52 years old and I've worked as a certified public accountant for 27 years. Widowed 5 years ago after my husband David passed from cancer. No children, but I consider our neighborhood community my extended family. I live in Desert Ridge Estates, one of those master-planned HOA communities in suburban Arizona, where every desert plant must be native species approved and house colors come in 6 predetermined shades, coordinating with the landscape. I purchased my corner property 12 years ago when David and I were looking for our forever home. We loved the community, the friendly neighbors, the well-maintained common areas. 3 years ago, after David passed, the community elected me HOA president. I ran on a platform of transparency, fair enforcement, and fiscal responsibility. Our little community of 138 homes had been struggling with mismanagement and rising fees under the previous board. I promised to fix that. And I did. We renegotiated contracts, implemented competitive bidding, reduced annual dues by 18%. The community was thriving under responsible leadership. What I hadn't anticipated was confronting Mitchell Crawford, a 45-year-old tech entrepreneur who moved into the neighborhood 8 months ago after selling his software company for millions. The man bought the largest property on Saguaro Boulevard, immediately began demanding special treatment, and seemed to believe his wealth entitled him to ignore community rules. Mitchell operates a silver Range Rover Sport that's larger than my first apartment. He's single, recently divorced, and treats our neighborhood like his personal kingdom where regulations shouldn't apply to him. The man challenges every HOA decision, demands exceptions to every rule, and has made it his personal mission to undermine my presidency since I wouldn't approve his request to install a non-approved water feature that violated our drought-conscious landscaping requirements. Now, here's where property layout becomes critical. My corner lot positioning means trash collection requires placing my container near the curb every Thursday morning. Municipal regulations specify within 3 feet of the street edge, which positions it precisely where Michelle takes his morning drive to his downtown office at exactly 6 feet. But Mitchell's route has alternatives. He could take the main boulevard exit, that's actually shorter and easier. Instead, he deliberately drives past my house, taking the narrow corner route that requires careful navigation around my properly positioned trash container. The initial incident occurred on a Thursday in October, second week after I denied his water feature application. I'm preparing for an early morning HOA budget meeting, coffee brewing. That familiar hydraulic hiss of the sanitation truck, still 20 minutes distant. Then crack, the noise of plastic shattering like a rifle shot. I rush outside, discovering my trash receptacle obliterated, refuse scattered across my driveway, resembling someone detonated a garbage bomb filled with coffee grounds and recycling materials. There's Mitchell reversing his Range Rover, lowering his tinted window with this manufactured concerned expression. "Oh, Barbara," he states, Absolutely zero authenticity in his tone. These corner angles are incredibly dangerous. Perhaps the HOA president should set a better example about proper container placement, proper placement. My container was positioned exactly where city ordinance requires, but I maintained composure, assumed it represented an unfortunate accident, invested 20 minutes collecting soggy cardboard and crushed aluminum while the scent of diesel exhaust lingered in the morning heat. My neighbor across the street, elderly Mr. Rodriguez, watched from his porch, shaking his head with concern. That initial week, identical incidents occurred 3 additional times. Same pattern, 6:45 precisely. That distinctive rumble of his oversized engine, the nauseating crunch of plastic colliding with steel, then silence as he departed. By Friday, suspicion was growing. By the following Thursday, certainty had arrived. Mr. Rodriguez confirmed my suspicions during our morning wave. "Barbara," he informed me in his careful manner, "that man takes the long way specifically to pass your house. I watch every morning. He has plenty of room, but he aims for your container deliberately." I attempted reasoning with Mitchell initially, intercepted him at the community mailbox during his evening mail collection. "Mitchell, we need to discuss the trash situation," but he interrupted with this condescending smile. "Barbara, perhaps if you focused less on denying reasonable homeowner requests and more on teaching residents proper waste management, we wouldn't have these traffic hazards. I understand you're struggling with the responsibilities of leadership, but some of us have actual businesses to run." The dismissive tone was infuriating, but I kept professional composure. That evening, I commenced researching property regulations, HOA bylaws, municipal codes, everything I'd studied years ago when I first joined the board but now needed to review with fresh urgency. Discovered that trash containers positioned on public easements still constitute personal property, and deliberate destruction constitutes vandalism regardless of who's driving. More significantly, our HOA contains no specific regulations regarding placement, timing, or construction materials for waste containers, merely that they cannot remain visible from streets except during collection days. By month's conclusion, I'd replace 4 trash containers at $68 total. Other board members were expressing concern about Mitchell's behavior, but nobody wanted direct confrontation with someone who'd already threatened legal action over his water feature denial. The community was experiencing tension regarding this wealthy newcomer who seemed determined to prove rules didn't apply to him. Something required changing. That's when the harassment escalated beyond property damage. Mitchell began attending every board meeting, challenging every decision, questioning every expenditure, and making thinly veiled accusations about my competence and integrity. During our November meeting, he actually stood up and suggested the community needed leadership that understood modern expectations, rather than outdated thinking from previous generations. The age discrimination was obvious to everyone present, but he delivered it with such polished corporate speak that documenting it for complaints proved challenging. He started a private Facebook group called Desert Ridge Accountability, where he posted conspiracy theories about board mismanagement and financial irregularities. Despite our transparent budgets and regular audits, he manufactured controversies about everything from landscaping contracts to pool maintenance expenses. Within 3 weeks, he'd recruited 17 residents to his group, mostly newer homeowners who didn't understand our history of reforms. The campaign was sophisticated and calculated. Mitchell clearly had experience manipulating corporate boards and was applying those same tactics to our neighborhood association. He filed formal complaints with the state HOA Oversight Board, alleging financial mismanagement despite our clean audits. He submitted public records requests for documents spanning back 5 years, creating administrative burdens that consumed volunteer board members' time. He threatened defamation lawsuits over meeting minutes that accurately documented his disruptive behavior. 3 weeks into November, Mitchell escalated from property vandalism to psychological warfare. I returned from my accounting firm discovering a certified letter awaiting, the type that creates immediate anxiety. The heavyweight paper felt expensive between my fingers, and the smell of fresh laser printing indicated this was professionally prepared. Legal notice regarding presidential misconduct and demand for resignation. It stated in threatening legal terminology, obviously drafted by an attorney. Allegations of preferential contract awards, unauthorized expenditures, and abuse of authority, each point completely fabricated but presented with enough official language to seem credible. The deadline: 10 days to resign voluntarily or face litigation for damages exceeding $50,000. He'd obviously invested considerable resources preparing this intimidation campaign. Here's where my 27 years of forensic accounting proved valuable. When someone makes financial allegations, you investigate thoroughly with documentation. That evening, I examined every board transaction from the past 3 years, like I was conducting an audit for federal investigators. After 6 hours of cross-referencing receipts, contracts, meeting minutes, and bank statements, I had comprehensive documentation proving every allegation was completely false. Better yet, I discovered something interesting. Mitchell had submitted contractor bids for several community projects through a shell company he controlled. When those bids weren't selected because they weren't the lowest qualified offers, his harassment campaign had begun. This wasn't about trash containers or water features. This was about a wealthy businessman, angry that his money couldn't buy preferential treatment, and attempting to bully the HOA president into resignation so he could install puppet leadership. I invested the weekend building my defense, like I was preparing for a corporate fraud investigation. Security camera system installed to document the morning destruction pattern, $78 for evidence collection. Professional boundary survey confirming my container positioning complied with all municipal requirements. Comprehensive financial audit documentation proving every board transaction was legitimate. Even convinced 3 other board members to provide statements about Mitchell's threatening behavior and intimidation tactics. But I needed more than defensive documentation. I needed to understand Mitchell's true motivations. Monday morning, I began investigating his background like I was vetting a potential fraud suspect. Public records are revealing when you understand corporate structures and financial relationships. Mitchell Crawford wasn't just a wealthy tech entrepreneur. He was a serial HOA manipulator. His previous neighborhood in California had filed restraining orders after he'd harassed their board president into resignation and then installed himself as president, immediately awarding lucrative contracts to his own companies. The pattern was identical. Move into upscale community, make unreasonable demands, escalate to harassment when denied, forced leadership changes, take control, award himself contracts. He'd done this twice before, each time walking away with hundreds of thousands in fraudulent contract payments before communities discovered the scheme and he moved to avoid prosecution. That revelation changed everything. This wasn't personal vindictiveness. This was calculated financial fraud, and I was his current target. By Tuesday's board meeting, I'd compiled documentation thick enough to overwhelm a filing cabinet, but I kept my discovery confidential, sharing only with our RKOA attorney who immediately recognized the pattern and began preparing legal countermeasures. The community center that evening was tense. Mitchell arrived with his attorney, clearly expecting intimidation tactics to force my resignation. But when I calmly presented the comprehensive financial documentation disproving every allegation, his confident expression faltered. And when our attorney casually mentioned discovering Mitchell's history in California and the ongoing investigations into his previous HOA schemes, the man's face lost color faster than paint fading in Arizona's sun. The meeting ended with Mitchell storming out, shouting threats about lawsuits and consequences. But everyone present had witnessed his facade crack, revealing the calculating fraud underneath the polished exterior. That night, I made a decision. Defense wasn't enough. If Mitchell wanted war, he'd get war, but fought with concrete evidence and legal prosecution rather than intimidation and harassment. The following morning brought the most aggressive collision yet. Mitchell's Range Rover struck my trash container at enough speed to not only destroy it, but scatter debris across 2 neighboring yards. Mr. Rodriguez captured the entire incident on his doorbell camera, including Mitchell's satisfied smirk as he drove away. That was his mistake. Because, that afternoon, I met with Carlos Mendoza at the Landscape Supply Center, and Carlos had an interesting suggestion about reinforced concrete trash containers that would teach entitled bullies very expensive lessons about physics and property rights. Carlos has been constructing hardscape installations throughout Arizona for 22 years. When I explained my situation over coffee at the supplier's contractor desk, his weathered face broke into a knowing smile. "You know, Barbara," he said, "there's absolutely nothing in municipal codes specifying what construction materials you can utilize for waste containers. Plastic, metal, concrete. As long as it contains refuse and meets dimensional requirements, you're completely compliant." That conversation planted an idea that would transform this situation from defensive posture to strategic offense. 90 pounds of rapid-setting concrete mix, steel reinforcement rebar for structural integrity, and a clever modification to a standard plastic exterior shell. Total investment, $62, versus the $380 I'd already spent on replacement containers. Thursday morning, I submitted another formal complaint with the county sheriff's office regarding the ongoing property destruction, now accompanied by 12 incidents of documented vandalism with video evidence and witness statements. Deputy Sarah Williams took the report seriously. "Mrs. Chun," she said, reviewing the doorbell camera footage, "this clearly shows intentional targeting. We're documenting this as criminal mischief with a pattern of harassment." Friday afternoon, I began my concrete project in my garage, mixing cement, positioning reinforcement bars, carefully pouring layers, while maintaining external appearance. The smell of curing concrete brought back memories of helping David pour our backyard patio years ago. That distinctive alkaline scent signified something permanent being created. The engineering was elegantly simple. Hollow bottom chamber for weight distribution, drainage perforations maintained for functionality, exterior appearance identical to every other container on our street. From external observation, it appeared standard. Inside, 90 pounds of steel-reinforced concrete awaited to deliver Mitchell a physics lesson about immovable objects. Saturday morning, I positioned my creation in precisely the same location as always, exactly compliant with municipal requirements. Sunday evening, I reviewed my documentation, video evidence of 13 collisions, financial records disproving Mitchell's allegations, background investigation revealing his pattern of HOA fraud, and my concrete solution ready for Monday morning's inevitable collision. The neighborhood was rallying behind me after Mitchell's outburst. 17 homeowners had approached me, expressing support. Mrs. Patterson reported he'd threatened to sue her over rose bushes. The Johnson family had received aggressive letters about their children's sidewalk chalk. This wasn't just about my trash container. This was about protecting our community from a calculating predator. Mitchell had chosen the wrong HOA president. He'd assumed a 52-year-old widow would be easily intimidated. What he hadn't anticipated was a forensic accountant with decades of fraud investigation experience, strong community support, and a woman who'd survived worse and wasn't surrendering to manufactured threats. Monday morning would bring the first test. My concrete fortress would validate my engineering, or reveal needed adjustments. The war was approaching its critical phase, and I was ready. HOA President versus Wealthy Bully, Part 2 of 4. Monday morning arrived with a kind of crystalline Arizona sunrise that makes you forget how brutal the summer heat can be. I stood at my kitchen window, chamomile tea steaming in my hands, watching the street like a general observing a battlefield. 6:43. Mitchell would arrive in precisely 2 minutes, as predictable as atomic clock precision. My concrete creation sat at the curb, appearing completely innocuous to any casual observer, just another beige trash container awaiting the sanitation truck. But I knew what waited inside that innocent-looking shell. 90 pounds of steel-reinforced concrete, engineered to withstand impacts that would demolish standard plastic containers. 6:44. I heard the distinctive rumble of his Range Rover engine, 3 blocks away. That deep, throaty sound that wealthy people seem to believe announces their importance. My phone was positioned on the windowsill, recording everything in high definition. Mr. Rodriguez stood on his porch across the street, coffee mug in hand, having arrived at his observation post after I'd texted him that this morning would be memorable. The silver Range Rover appeared around the corner, sunlight glinting off its pristine paint job. Mitchell was right on schedule, and I could see his expression even from my window, that self-satisfied smirk he always wore when approaching my property, the look of someone who genuinely enjoyed causing distress to others. He accelerated slightly as he neared my trash container, exactly as he'd done 43 previous times. The impact came at approximately 22 miles per hour. The sound was nothing like the previous collisions. Instead of that sickening crunch of plastic exploding, there was a solid metallic thunk that echoed down the street, followed immediately by the screech of metal scraping concrete and the distinctive pop of a tire meeting immovable resistance. Mitch's Range Rover lurched violently to the right, the front passenger side panel crumpling like aluminum foil. The running board tore completely free, clattering across the asphalt like discarded trash. My concrete container, it shifted approximately 3 inches and sat there, looking supremely unbothered by the entire encounter. I watched Mitchell's face transform from smug satisfaction to absolute shock. He sat frozen in his driver's seat for at least 30 seconds, mouth actually hanging open as his brain attempted to process what had just occurred. His $75,000 luxury vehicle had just lost an argument with my $62 concrete creation, and the cognitive dissonance was apparently overwhelming. Finally, he opened his door and stepped out, expansive Italian leather shoes crunching on scattered debris from his demolished running board. He walked around to examine the damage, and even from my kitchen window I could see his complexion transitioning from shocked pale to furious red. The passenger panel was deeply dented, paint scraped away, revealing bare metal underneath. The running board lay in pieces across the street. The front tire showed visible damage, already deflating with a slow hiss that I could hear through my closed window. Mr. Rodriguez raised his coffee mug in a subtle salute toward my window. I raised my teacup in return, feeling something I hadn't experienced in months, the satisfaction of watching a bully encounter consequences. Mitchell stared at my trash container like it had personally betrayed him. He kicked it, immediately regretting that decision as pain shot through his expensive shoe. The container didn't move. He pulled out his phone, presumably calling insurance. I gave him 5 minutes before stepping outside with coffee and my most pleasant expression. "Good morning, Mitchell. Hope everything's all right?" His response was volcanic. "You did this deliberately. That thing is illegal. I'll have you arrested." I maintained calm. "Mitchell, my container is positioned exactly where municipal code requires. It's constructed from legal materials. If you're experiencing damage from colliding with properly positioned property, perhaps consider alternative routes or more careful driving." That suggestion seemed to short-circuit his rationality. "You think you're clever?" he hissed, stepping closer. Intimidatingly, "I've destroyed people far more competent than you. This neighborhood will be rid of you before Christmas." That threat was his second mistake. Mr. Rodriguez's doorbell camera captured every word, every threatening gesture. Deputy Williams had instructed me to document further harassment for potential stalking charges. I simply smiled and returned inside, leaving Mitchell shouting obscenities at my closed door. The neighborhood certainly got entertainment that morning. By noon, doorbell camera footage of the collision had circulated to 37 households. The sound of steel-reinforced concrete stopping a Range Rover became the talk of Desert Ridge estates. People who'd been quietly suffering Mitchell's harassment for months suddenly felt emboldened to discuss their experiences. Mrs. Patterson called me that afternoon, her voice shaking with relief and vindication. "Barbara, I cannot thank you enough. That man has been terrorizing this neighborhood since he arrived, and watching his expensive vehicle get demolished by your trash container was the most satisfying thing I've witnessed in years." By evening, 17 homeowners had contacted me, sharing their own Mitchell horror stories. He'd threatened the Gonzalez family over their children's basketball hoop. He'd sent cease and desist letters to 3 households over minor landscaping choices. He'd filed noise complaints about Mrs. Chun's weekly mahjong gatherings, trying to force her to stop hosting her elderly friends. The pattern was clear and systematic. Mitchell Crawford was attempting to make the neighborhood so unpleasant that he could eventually purchase properties at distressed prices and flip them for profit, a scheme he'd apparently executed successfully in his previous communities. That evening, I received a call from our HOA attorney, Richard Morrison. "Barbara," he began, "I've reviewed the documentation you provided regarding Mr. Crawford's background. This is significantly more serious than simple neighborhood harassment. We're looking at potential RICO violations, if we can establish a pattern of fraud across multiple jurisdictions. RICO Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the same statute used to prosecute organized crime." Richard explained that Mitchell's pattern of targeting HOA leaders, forcing governance changes, awarding himself contracts through shell companies, and then fleeing before prosecution qualified as an ongoing criminal enterprise if we could document it properly. The California communities he'd victimized were eager to cooperate with our investigation. One had unsuccessfully attempted prosecution but lacked sufficient evidence linking his harassment campaign to the subsequent fraudulent contracts. We had the opportunity to succeed where they'd failed. Tuesday morning brought collision attempt number 2. Mitchell apparently hadn't learned his lesson, or perhaps he genuinely believed that repeated ramming would eventually damage my concrete fortress. This time he approached from a different angle, accelerating to approximately 25 miles per hour before impact. The result was predictably disastrous for his Range Rover. The front bumper cracked completely, hanging loosely like a broken jaw. The headlight housing shattered, scattering expensive xenon components across the pavement. The collision detection sensors began emitting a constant warning beep that echoed through the morning silence. And my trash container? It shifted perhaps 4 inches and developed a small scuff mark that actually made it look more authentically used. Mitchell didn't even bother exiting his vehicle this time. He simply sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at my container with what appeared to be genuine hatred for an inanimate object. Then he reversed carefully, damaged bumper-scraping asphalt, and drove away, leaving a trail of automotive fluid and shattered plastic. I submitted the updated video evidence to Deputy Williams within 20 minutes. She called back within the hour. "Mrs. Chun, we're escalating this to the detective division. This is now documented as stalking, criminal mischief, and we're investigating possible insurance fraud based on the information you provided. Mr. Crawford should expect contact from investigators very soon." The insurance fraud angle was particularly interesting. Mitchell had filed a claim for road hazard damage, alleging he'd struck a concealed obstacle on a public street. The problem was the comprehensive video evidence showing deliberate, repeated targeting of my specific property over a 2-month period. State Farm's Special Investigations Unit doesn't appreciate fraudulent claims, especially ones this blatantly documented. That afternoon brought the escalation I'd been anticipating but hoping to avoid. I returned from my accounting firm, discovering someone had spray-painted obscenities across my driveway in bright orange paint. The language was crude, and the threats were specific enough to constitute criminal intimidation. More concerning, they'd attempted to vandalize my concrete trash container with what appeared to be battery acid, leaving burn marks and discoloration but no structural damage. The chemical attack crossed a serious line. This wasn't just property destruction anymore. This was potentially dangerous criminal activity. I called Deputy Williams immediately, and she arrived within 15 minutes, along with a crime scene technician who collected samples of the acid residue. The spray paint removal would cost approximately $300. The acid damage was cosmetic, but permanent. And the psychological impact of having someone commit vandalism on my property while I was working was exactly what Mitchell intended. But he'd made a critical error. The timing of the vandalism coincided perfectly with Mitchell's morning whereabouts. According to doorbell cameras throughout the neighborhood, multiple residents had captured his Range Rover, driving slowly past my house 3 separate times between 10 and 11 that morning, when the vandalism occurred. He hadn't personally wielded the spray paint, but he'd been surveilling the property during the crime, and his damaged vehicle was distinctly identifiable in the footage. Wednesday brought an unexpected development. A professional investigator named Marcus Holloway contacted me, explaining he'd been hired by the California HOA associations Mitchell had previously victimized. They'd pooled resources to build a comprehensive case, and my documentation was the missing piece they needed to establish the pattern across multiple jurisdictions. Marcus spent 3 hours at my dining table, reviewing evidence, taking statements, and explaining how these fraud schemes typically operated. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Target established HOA leadership, manufactured grievances and violations, escalate to harassment and intimidation. Force leadership resignation or removal, install puppet board members, award contracts to shell companies, extract maximum profit, then flee before investigation concludes. The average take per community ranged from $50,000 to $200,000 depending on neighborhood, size, and available contracts. Desert Ridge. Estates with our recent capital improvement budget represented potential profit exceeding $150,000 if Mitchell successfully gained control. That's when the enormity of this situation crystallized. This wasn't about trash containers or personal vendetta. This was about protecting 138 families from systematic financial fraud. Mitchell Crawford was a predator who specialized in exploiting the exact community structures designed to protect homeowners. Thursday morning, Mitchell made his most aggressive attempt yet. He accelerated to approximately 30 miles per hour before striking my concrete container. The impact was spectacular. His front axle bent visibly on collision, causing the Range Rover to drop several inches and scrape asphalt as he tried limping away. Both front airbags deployed, filling his cabin with white powder and the acrid smell of chemical propellant. The collision detection system went into full alarm mode, creating a cacophony that woke the entire neighborhood. And my container, it shifted about 6 inches, developed another scuff mark, and sat there radiating an almost smug satisfaction at having survived another assault. This time Mitchell couldn't drive away. His Range Rover was effectively disabled. Sitting in the middle of the street with both airbags deployed and front wheels pointing at odd angles, indicating serious suspension damage. He climbed out, face streaked with airbag powder, looking like a defeated general surveying battlefield losses. The sanitation truck arrived while he was still standing there. The driver, a cheerful man named Jerome, who'd been collecting our neighborhood trash for 6 years, navigated carefully around the disabled Range Rover and collected my container's contents without comment, though I noticed him taking several photos of the collision aftermath, presumably for his own entertainment. By noon, a tow truck had removed Mitchell's demolished vehicle. The damage estimate, I later learned, approached $12,000. His insurance company had already denied the claim based on evidence I'd provided, showing intentional, repeated collisions rather than accidental damage. Mitchell Crawford had just spent $75,000 on a vehicle he'd effectively destroyed through his own aggressive harassment campaign. And we were just getting started. That afternoon, I received notice that our HOA would hold an emergency board meeting Friday evening to address escalating community concerns. Mitchell had demanded the meeting, clearly intending to present his motion for my removal as president, but he had no idea what evidence would be waiting for him, or that the state attorney general's office had been copied on every piece of documentation regarding his multi-state fraud pattern. Friday would bring the confrontation that had been building since October, and I was prepared with concrete evidence in more ways than one. Thursday evening, my living room became an impromptu organizing center. 23 households arrived with documentation of Mitchell's harassment. Mrs. Pedersen brought 12 threatening letters about landscaping. The Gonzalez family had screenshots of aggressive social media posts about their children. Mrs. Chen compiled noise complaints filed against her legal mahjong gatherings. The accumulated evidence painted systematic neighborhood terrorism. Tom Anderson, a retired attorney, reviewed everything professionally. Barbara, this isn't just harassment. This is conspiracy to interfere with property rights, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and possibly elder abuse, given his targeting of seniors. If he gains board control, every homeowner here could have legal claims. I spent until midnight organizing the presentation, timeline charts showing harassment patterns, financial analysis demonstrating Mitchell's previous schemes, video compilations of trash container collisions, witness statements from 17 households. Marcus Aloe provided additional documentation from California showing shell company structures, contract award patterns, and financial transfers suggesting money laundering. The total scope across 3 states potentially exceeded $400,000. Friday morning arrived overcast, unusual for Arizona. I dressed professionally in navy suit, reviewed presentation materials, ensuring every document was organized. By 6:30, 90 minutes early, 47 residents had already claimed seats. The energy felt electric. Mitchell arrived at 7:45 with 2 attorneys, clearly intending to overwhelm with legal firepower. His confidence was palpable, but he limped slightly from kicking my concrete container, and stress lines showed on his face. The meeting opened with standard business. Mitchell sat impatiently while his attorney checked an expensive watch. Then Tom Richardson made the motion. I move that we address the documented harassment pattern by Mitchell Crawford, including evidence suggesting systematic fraud and criminal activity. Mitchell's attorneys objected immediately, throwing around defamation and slander claims, but Tom cited specific bylaws permitting this review when homeowner safety was at stake. For 45 minutes, I presented evidence methodically. Video of 46 deliberate collisions, witness testimony from 23 households, financial analysis from California, background investigation revealing his HOA manipulation pattern across multiple states, the acid attack, spray paint vandalism, aggressive confrontations on doorbell cameras. Mitchell's confident expression transformed into barely controlled rage. His attorney argued circumstantial evidence that clients have rights to pursue legal grievances, that this presentation constituted harassment, but then Marcus Holloway stood from the back row, identified himself as a private investigator working with law enforcement, and announced that criminal investigations were active in 3 jurisdictions regarding Crawford's activities. Mitchell exploded, shouting about conspiracy, manipulation, threatening lawsuits against everyone present. His attorneys tried restraining him, but he'd lost control completely. The sophisticated businessman mask stripped away. That's when Deputy Williams entered with Detective Raymond Chun from Financial Crimes. They'd been invited to observe, and Mitchell's outburst gave them exactly what they needed. The meeting concluded with unanimous board vote 4-0 to ban Mitchell from HOA common areas pending investigation, pursue legal action for damages, and cooperate fully with law enforcement. Mitchell stormed out, attorneys trailing behind counseling restraint, leaving behind a community that had successfully defended itself. But I knew this wasn't over. Cornered and desperate, facing criminal prosecution, Mitchell Crawford would likely become even more dangerous before this fully resolved. HOA President versus Wealthy Bully, Part 3 of 4. The weekend following Friday's explosive board meeting brought an eerie calm to Desert Ridge Estates, the kind of silence that precedes a desert storm. Mitchell's Range Rover sat in his driveway like a wounded animal, covered with a tarp but still displaying obvious damage underneath. His house remained dark most of the weekend, curtains drawn, no visible activity. Mr. Rodriguez reported that Mitchell had been loading boxers into a rental truck Saturday afternoon, which suggested either preparation for extended absence or potential flight from jurisdiction. I spent Saturday morning meeting with our HOA attorney Richard Morrison and Detective Chun to coordinate the legal strategy moving forward. The evidence we'd compiled was substantial, but building a prosecutable case across multiple jurisdictions required careful coordination between Arizona authorities and their California counterparts. Detective Chun spread crime scene photos and financial documents across the conference table in Richard's office. Mrs. Chun, he began, using his reading glasses to review specific documents. What we're looking at here extends far beyond simple neighborhood harassment. Mr. Crawford's operation follows a sophisticated pattern that suggests professional experience with financial fraud. He explained that Mitchell's scheme involved creating legitimate-looking shell companies, often registered in states with minimal corporate transparency requirements like Delaware or Nevada, then using those entities to bid on HOA contracts. The bids would be competitive, sometimes even lowest bidder, to avoid suspicion. But the actual work would be subcontracted to cheaper providers, while Mitchell's companies pocketed the difference. Additionally, he'd often recommend unnecessary projects to HOA boards he controlled, generating contracts for problems that didn't actually require expensive solutions. The California investigation had identified 3 separate communities where Mitchell had executed this scheme successfully. In each case, He'd moved into an upscale immediately begun challenging existing leadership, manufactured controversies that forced board resignations, installed friendly board members who'd approve his contracts, extracted between $75,000 and $200,000, then relocated before investigations concluded. The pattern was remarkably consistent, almost like following a playbook. In Riverside, California, he'd targeted a retirement community, taking advantage of elderly board members who were less familiar with modern fraud schemes. In San Diego, he'd manipulated a young professional neighborhood by offering impressive credentials and tech industry connections. Each community showed the same trajectory: disruption, takeover, extraction, departure. What made our situation different was the comprehensive documentation. Previous communities had suspected fraud but lacked the evidence needed for prosecution. Riverside's HOA president had actually died during their conflict with Mitchell, a 73-year-old man who suffered a heart attack 3 days after Mitchell's particularly aggressive board meeting confrontation. While no direct causation could be proved, the timing was suspicious and tragic. San Diego's community had attempted legal action but couldn't afford the prolonged litigation when Mitchell's attorneys buried them in motions and delays. Between my accounting background, the multiple witness testimonies, the video evidence of harassment, Marcus Holloway's multi-state investigation, and crucially, my refusal to be intimidated into silence, we had built something prosecutable. My CPA training meant I understood forensic accounting principles. My widowhood meant I had time to dedicate to this fight without family obligations. My position as HOA president meant I had legitimate authority to request documents and conduct inquiries. Everything had aligned to make me uniquely positioned to stop Mitchell's pattern. Richard Morrison outlined the legal timeline. Civil lawsuit for damages related to property destruction and harassment would proceed immediately. Criminal charges for stalking and vandalism were likely within 2 weeks pending final evidence review. The fraud investigation across multiple states would take longer, probably 4 to 6 months before indictments, but the foundation was solid. Monday morning brought the development I'd been anticipating with mixed feelings. Mitchell's attorneys contacted Richard, requesting a settlement conference. The message was professionally worded but clearly desperate. Their client was willing to discuss resolution of all outstanding matters, including voluntary departure from the community and financial compensation for documented damages. The settlement offer arrived Tuesday afternoon via certified mail: $15,000 in exchange for mutual releases, non-disclosure agreement, and Mitchell's commitment to sell his property within 90 days and relocate from Desert Ridge Estates permanently. Richard reviewed the offer with professional skepticism. "Barbara, this is substantially lower than what we could likely obtain through litigation. Your documented damages alone exceed $8,000. The emotional distress claims, the impact on your HOA presidency, the community disruption, we're looking at potential recovery exceeding $50,000 if we proceed to trial. But there's strategic value in quick resolution. It removes him from the community immediately and allows us to focus on the criminal prosecution without civil litigation complications." I considered the offer carefully. $15,000 was significant money, enough to cover all my expenses plus compensation for the stress and time invested in fighting this battle. More importantly, it guaranteed Mitchell's departure from our neighborhood, protecting other residents from further harassment. But accepting settlement meant signing non-disclosure agreements that could complicate the criminal investigation and prevent me from discussing the case publicly. I thought about the Riverside HOA president who died during his conflict with Mitchell. I thought about the San Diego community that had been forced to abandon their legal pursuit due to financial constraints. I thought about the next neighborhood Mitchell would target if we simply let him walk away with minimal consequences. That night, I called a meeting with the homeowners who'd been most active in supporting the investigation. 22 residents gathered in my living room Tuesday evening to discuss the settlement offer. I'd prepared detailed handouts outlining the pros and cons of settlement versus continued litigation. The reactions were mixed and passionate. Mrs. Patterson argued passionately for accepting. "Barbara, that man has caused enough damage. If $15,000 makes him go away and never come back, that's worth more than any amount we might win in court. Years from now, my health has suffered from this stress. I just want peace restored to our neighborhood." Her voice cracked with emotion, and several other residents nodded in agreement. The toll on our community had been significant, and many people simply wanted closure. Tom Anderson, the retired attorney, disagreed firmly. "This isn't just about Barbara's case anymore. If we let him settle and disappear quietly, he'll just move to another community and do exactly the same thing. We have a responsibility to stop this pattern permanently. He has a documented history spanning multiple states. We finally have the evidence to end his criminal enterprise. Settling now would be like treating the symptom but ignoring the disease." The Gonzalez family raised practical concerns about the time commitment required for continued litigation. Maria spoke about how the conflict had already consumed months of their lives, affected their children who'd become anxious about neighborhood tensions, and created financial stress through legal consultation expenses. Several younger families echoed these concerns, noting that their careers and family obligations made prolonged legal battles challenging. The discussion continued for 2 hours, voices occasionally raised in passionate disagreement, but ultimately everyone respected that this was my decision to make. I'd been the primary target. I'd absorbed the worst of the harassment, and I'd be the one signing any settlement agreement. By 10 o'clock, I'd reached my conclusion. I would counteroffer $25,000, no non-disclosure agreement regarding criminal matters, and Mitchell's cooperation with the multi-state fraud investigation in exchange for my civil claims being resolved. If he accepted those terms, we'd have both financial compensation and his assistance in building the broader case. If he rejected them, we'd proceed to full litigation and let the courts decide. Wednesday morning brought unexpected vindication. The state attorney general's office announced they were opening a formal investigation into HOA fraud schemes operating across Arizona. Mitchell Crawford was specifically named in the press release as a subject of the investigation, along with details about his pattern of targeting community associations. The publicity was devastating for whatever remained of his reputation. Local news channels picked up the story, and by Wednesday evening, Mitchell's face was appearing on broadcasts across Phoenix with headlines like "Serial, HOA fraudster exposed and tech millionaire accused of neighborhood scams." The media attention changed everything. Mitchell's attorneys contacted Richard Thursday morning, accepting my counteroffer in full. $25,000, no non-disclosure restrictions on criminal matters, and full cooperation with investigators. The settlement agreement was drafted, reviewed, and executed within 48 hours. By Saturday afternoon, I had a certified check for $25,000, and Mitchell had listed his property for sale. The criminal case proceeded independently of our civil settlement. Detective Chun worked with California authorities to compile a comprehensive case file spanning Mitchell's activities across 4 states and 7 different communities. The total alleged fraud exceeded $600,000, enough to trigger federal prosecution under interstate fraud statutes. The forensic accounting revealed even more sophisticated criminal activity than initially suspected. Mitchell had been manipulating HOA reserve fund investments, directing community assets into investment vehicles where he received kickbacks. He'd been recommending specific insurance providers who paid him undisclosed commissions. He'd even been falsifying maintenance reports to justify unnecessary repair contracts. The scope was staggering. In early December, Mitchell was arrested at his Desert Ridge Estates home. The charges included 12 counts of fraud, 6 counts of stalking and harassment, 3 counts of insurance fraud, and 2 counts of money laundering. Bail was set at $200,000, which he posted immediately, but he was required to surrender his passport and remain in Arizona pending trial. His house sold within 3 weeks, well below market value, in a desperate quick sale. By December 20th, Mitchell Crawford had permanently departed Desert Ridge Estates. The neighborhood held a community gathering the evening after his moving truck left. 47 households attended, bringing food and drinks to celebrate our collective victory. The atmosphere was jubilant, but also reflective. We'd successfully defended our community, but the experience had revealed vulnerabilities in HOA governance structures that needed addressing. That evening, standing in the community center surrounded by neighbors who'd become genuine friends through this ordeal, I proposed new mandatory financial audits every 2 years. term limits for board members to prevent transparent contractor bidding requirements with multiple competitive bids for any project exceeding $5,000, mandatory disclosure of any board member financial interests in vendors. The reforms passed unanimously at our January board meeting, but the most satisfying development came in February. The multi-state prosecution had moved forward aggressively, and prosecutors offered Mitchell a plea agreement, pled guilty to federal fraud charges, accept a 30-month prison sentence, pay restitution totaling $480,000 to victimized communities, and cooperate fully in identifying other individuals operating similar schemes. The alternative was proceeding to trial on charges that could result in 15 years federal imprisonment. Mitchell accepted the plea agreement. In late February, he stood before a federal judge and formally pleaded guilty to orchestrating a multi-state HOA fraud scheme. The judge's sentencing remarks were particularly pointed. Mr. Crawford, you targeted communities built on trust and mutual cooperation. You exploited the very governance structures designed to protect homeowners. Your actions represent a betrayal of the fundamental principles that make neighborhood associations function. For his victims, the restitution provided meaningful compensation. Our HOA received $38,000, substantially more than the $25,000 I'd settled for personally. Those funds went directly into community improvements. We renovated the playground, upgraded our irrigation systems to more water-efficient technology, and established a reserve fund for future capital projects. The concrete trash container that had started this entire conflict was donated to the community center, where it now sits in the lobby with a bronze plaque reading, "Sometimes standing firm requires concrete principles." It's become something of a neighborhood landmark, and new residents always ask about the story behind the reinforced trash receptacle. My role as HOA president evolved significantly after Mitchell's departure. The community had witnessed effective leadership under pressure, and the respect I'd earned translated into stronger participation in board meetings, better compliance with community guidelines, and genuine neighborhood cohesion. We implemented monthly community gatherings, started a neighborhood watch program, and created a welcoming committee for new residents. The trauma of Mitchell's harassment campaign had paradoxically strengthened our community bonds. For me personally, the experience was transformative in unexpected ways. I'd spent 5 years as a widow, focused primarily on work and HOA responsibilities, maintaining David's memory through community service, but somewhat isolated emotionally. Fighting Mitchell's harassment had forced me to build genuine connections with neighbors, to accept help from others, to trust in collective action. Mrs. Pattison became a close friend. The Gonzalez family and I started a weekly dinner tradition. Mr. Rodriguez and I began morning coffee conversations on his porch, discussing neighborhood matters and sharing stories about our late spouses. The concrete trash container became a symbol not just of resistance, but of community resilience. Local media continued following the story, and I was invited to speak at several HOA conferences about fraud prevention and community organizing. The settlement money I'd received personally went toward establishing a legal defense fund for homeowners facing harassment, ensuring others would have resources I'd fortunately possessed through my accounting background. By spring, Desert Ridge Estates had become something of a model community. Our transparent governance, active resident participation, and successful defense against fraud attracted positive attention. Property values actually increased despite, or perhaps because of the publicized conflict. Prospective buyers appreciated knowing they were moving into a community that took governance seriously and protected residents effectively. The final chapter came in March when I received a letter from one of the California communities Mitchell had previously victimized. Their HOA president wrote, thanking me for the investigation that had led to restitution for their residents. She described how they'd suspected fraud but lacked resources to pursue it, how they'd felt helpless watching Mitchell disappear with their community funds. Our documentation had provided the evidence they needed to finally obtain justice. That letter reminded me why this fight had been worthwhile. It wasn't just about my trash container or my personal vindication. It was about establishing accountability, protecting vulnerable communities, and proving that ordinary residents could successfully defend themselves against sophisticated fraud when they worked together with determination and proper documentation. Mitchell Crawford was currently serving his federal sentence at a minimum security facility in California. He'd be released in approximately 18 months with supervised probation for 3 additional years. His assets had been largely seized to pay restitution, his professional reputation destroyed, his freedom restricted. The consequences were substantial and entirely appropriate for someone who'd systematically exploited community trust for personal profit. As for my concrete trash container, it continued serving its original purpose at my curb every Thursday morning, now somewhat famous throughout Arizona HOA communities. Occasionally, tourists, usually HOA board members from other neighborhoods, would actually drive by to photograph it. The absurdity of having created an accidentally famous trash receptacle never failed to amuse me. But perhaps that's fitting. Sometimes the most mundane objects become symbols of larger principles. Sometimes standing firm requires concrete resolve. And sometimes a 50-year-old widow with accounting skills and a reinforced trash container can take down a sophisticated criminal enterprise, protect her community, and prove that bullies eventually encounter immovable resistance. HOA President vs. Wealthy Bully Part 4 of 4 finale. Spring arrived in Desert Ridge Estates with the kind of renewal that felt symbolic. The desert landscape burst into unexpected color, wildflowers appearing seemingly overnight after winter rains. The neighborhood felt lighter somehow, as though Mitchell Crawford's departure had lifted an oppressive weight none of us had fully recognized while living under it. My morning routine had changed dramatically. Thursday mornings no longer brought anxiety about potential vehicle collisions. Instead, I found myself actually enjoying the simple act of wheeling my famous concrete trash container to the curb, occasionally exchanging waves with neighbors who were also conducting their morning routines. The normalcy was remarkable, precisely because it had been absent for so long. The community transformation extended far beyond Mitchell's absence. Our reformed HOA governance structure was attracting attention from neighborhood associations throughout Arizona. The mandatory financial audits, transparent contractor bidding, term limits, and conflict of interest disclosure requirements we'd implemented became a model that other communities started adopting. I received invitations to speak at HOA conferences across the Southwest, sharing our experience and the lessons we'd learned about protecting community governance from predatory fraud. My first speaking engagement was in Tucson at the Arizona Leadership Summit in late March. Standing before 200 HOA board members from across the state, I felt David's presence encouraging me. He'd always believed I had gifts for leadership and communication that I underutilized. This unexpected platform felt like fulfilling potential I hadn't recognized in myself. I titled my presentation Concrete Resistance: How One Community Stopped a Serial Fraudster. The reaction was overwhelming. Attendees lined up afterward asking questions, sharing their own experiences with problematic homeowners, requesting copies of our reformed bylaw. Several board presidents described situations that sounded disturbingly similar to Mitchell's early harassment patterns, and I found myself providing impromptu consultations about documentation strategies and legal resources. That evening, driving home through the desert sunset, I realized this had become my mission, not just protecting Desert Ridge Estates, but helping other communities recognize and defend against similar threats. The expertise I'd gained through our conflict with Mitchell represented valuable knowledge that could prevent other neighborhoods from experiencing the same trauma. By April, I'd formalized this mission by establishing the Community Governance Defense Fund, a nonprofit organization providing free legal consultation and resources to HOA communities facing harassment or fraud. The fund was financed initially by my settlement money from Mitchell and donations from Desert Ridge residents who wanted to support the cause. Within 3 months, we'd helped 12 Arizona communities address governance problems, ranging from financial irregularities to board member harassment. The most gratifying cases involved helping elderly HOA leaders who were being targeted by aggressive residents similar to Mitchell. In one Scottsdale community, a 70-year-old board president was being systematically harassed by a wealthy homeowner demanding special exceptions. Using our documentation strategies and legal resources, they successfully defended their authority and exposed the homeowner's pattern of intimidation. That president called me in tears after their board meeting victory, saying she'd felt hopeless until discovering our organization. Those moments made every difficult hour of my conflict with Mitchell worthwhile. Back in Desert Ridge Estates, the community continued flourishing under reformed governance. Our monthly community gatherings had evolved from awkward obligatory meetings into genuine social events. May's gathering featured a potluck dinner with 63 residents attending, the highest participation we'd ever achieved. Children played on the renovated playground equipment we'd purchased with Mitchell's restitution money, while adults shared food and conversation under string lights in the community center. Courtyard. Mrs. Patterson organized a neighborhood book club that met bi-weekly at rotating host homes. The Gonzalez family started a youth soccer league using our common areas. Mr. Rodriguez established a gardening club focused on drought-resistant landscaping techniques. The sense of community cohesion was remarkable, and I couldn't help wondering if Mitchell's threat had paradoxically strengthened bonds that might otherwise have remained superficial. The concrete trash container continued its unlikely fame. Local news had done a follow-up feature in April, titled "The Trash Can That Took Down a Fraudster," which went semi-viral on social media. We started receiving requests from other HOA communities wanting to photograph our famous receptacle. The community center began offering unofficial tours, and the donation jar beside the trash container's display raised over $3,000 for our community improvement fund. The absurdity of having a tourist attraction trash container never stopped amusing me, but it served as a powerful symbol. Physical resistance matters. Sometimes you need concrete solutions to concrete problems. Standing firm requires both metaphorical and literal strength. June brought closure to Mitchell's legal situation. His sentencing hearing was scheduled for June 15th at the federal courthouse in Phoenix. Richard Morrison called asking if I wanted to attend and potentially provide a victim impact statement. The opportunity to directly address Mitchell in court was tempting, but I'd already said everything that needed saying. My evidence had spoken clearly. The community's response had been definitive. What more needed to be articulated? But Marcus Holloway convinced me to attend. "Barbara," he said during a phone conversation, "these cases often feel abstract to judges. Financial fraud gets reduced to numbers on spreadsheets. Your presence reminds everyone that real people suffered real harm. Your testimony could influence sentencing and set precedent for future cases." So I went, accompanied by Mrs. Patterson, Tom Anderson, and a dozen other Desert Ridge residents who wanted to witness justice being served. The courtroom was surprisingly small and institutional, nothing like the dramatic settings portrayed in legal dramas. Mitchell sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit, looking diminished somehow. Prison had aged him visibly. The confident swagger was completely absent, replaced by the defeated posture of someone who'd gambled aggressively and lost everything. When the judge invited victim impact statements, I approached the podium with the same prepared speech I'd delivered at countless HOA meetings. But standing there, looking at Mitchell directly, I found myself setting aside my written remarks and speaking from a different place. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steadier than expected, "Mitchell Crawford didn't just commit financial crimes. He weaponized fear, isolation, and intimidation against people trying to maintain their homes and communities. He specifically targeted vulnerable individuals, elderly residents, single parents, minorities, anyone he perceived as less capable of defending themselves. I described the stress of wondering each morning whether my property would be vandalized, the anxiety of checking doorbell cameras constantly, the impact on my work performance and personal well-being. I talked about the Riverside HOA president who died during his conflict with Mitchell, the families who'd been driven from their homes by harassment, the communities that had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars to his schemes, and I explained why prosecution mattered beyond simple punishment. Communities need to know that fraud has consequences, that harassment will be prosecuted, that wealth and aggressive legal tactics cannot shield criminals from accountability. When I finished, several people in the courtroom were visibly emotional. The judge thanked me for my testimony and noted that these impact statements provided crucial context for understanding the scope of Mitchell's crimes. The judge sentenced Mitchell to the agreed-upon 30 months federal imprisonment, 3 years supervised probation upon release, and restitution totaling $480,000 to victimized communities. But he added something unexpected. He imposed additional special conditions prohibiting Mitchell from serving on any HOA board for 15 years after release and requiring him to disclose his criminal history to any HOA community where he might reside. Those conditions effectively ended Mitchell's ability to perpetrate similar schemes for the foreseeable future. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt something shift internally. The anger I'd carried for months had transformed into something else. Not quite forgiveness, but perhaps acceptance that justice had been achieved. Mitchell would serve meaningful time, pay substantial restitution, and face long-term consequences. Our community had been protected, and other communities had received warning about his patterns. Summer brought unexpected personal developments. Tom Richardson, our HOA vice president, announced he was relocating to Oregon for family reasons, creating a board vacancy. The community urged me to appoint someone, but I suggested something different. Instead of appointment, we held a special election with 3 candidates, allowing residents to actively participate in selecting their leadership. The election drew 92 votes, the highest participation in Desert Ridge history. The winner was Maria Gonzalez, whose family had been targeted by Mitchell's harassment. Her victory felt symbolic of the community's transformation from passive governance to active engagement. Meanwhile, my work with the Community Governance Defense Fund was expanding beyond Arizona. We'd receive requests from HOA communities in Nevada, New Mexico, and California seeking guidance on governance reforms and fraud prevention. The organization was growing faster than anticipated, requiring me to consider whether this should remain a volunteer project or become my full-time focus. In July, I made a significant decision. After 27 years with my accounting firm, I negotiated a transition to part-time status, dedicating 3 days weekly to the Defense Fund. The financial sacrifice was substantial, but my settlement, money, and increasingly successful non-profit fundraising made it sustainable. More importantly, the work felt meaningful in ways my accounting career, while successful, had never quite achieved. I was using my professional skills to protect vulnerable communities and prevent the kind of trauma we'd experienced. David would have supported this decision. He'd always encouraged me to find work that fed my soul rather than just my bank account. This felt like honoring his memory while building something valuable. August marked 1 year since Mitchell's first trash container collision. The anniversary felt significant enough to warrant community recognition. We organized a Desert Ridge Resilience celebration, featuring food trucks, live music, and activities for all ages. The centerpiece was a ceremony unveiling a permanent memorial in the community center lobby. Beside my famous concrete trash container, we installed a plaque reading, "In recognition of community courage." When faced with intimidation and fraud, Desert Ridge Estates residents stood together, documented truth, and demanded accountability. May this container remind us that sometimes the strongest resistance requires the firmest foundation. Dedicated August 2024. 78 residents attended the ceremony, many sharing brief testimonials about how the conflict had affected them and what they'd learned about community solidarity. Mrs. Chun spoke movingly about how the experience had taught her that speaking up, despite fear and cultural reticence, was sometimes necessary for collective protection. The Gonzalez children talked about learning that standing up to bullies, even powerful ones, was possible when communities worked together. Tom Anderson noted that authentic leadership emerged during crisis, and he was honored to have witnessed my transformation from careful HOA administrator to fierce community defender. That evening, standing in the community center, surrounded by neighbors who'd become genuine friends, I felt overwhelming gratitude for this unexpected journey. Mitchell's harassment had been traumatic and costly, But it had also revealed strength I hadn't known I possessed and created connections that enriched my life immeasurably. The concrete trash container that started everything continued serving its mundane purpose every Thursday morning. But it had become something more significant. Symbol of resistance against intimidation. Reminder that ordinary people can defend against extraordinary threats. Testament to the reality that sometimes the simplest solutions, like literally reinforcing your defenses, prove most effective. Mitchell Crawford was serving his sentence at a federal facility in California, scheduled for release in approximately 18 months. I didn't spend much time thinking about his situation anymore. He'd made choices that led to consequences, and justice had been appropriately served. My focus was forward, on protecting other communities, strengthening our neighborhood, and building the legacy that this unlikely conflict had initiated. As fall approached, bringing relief from summer heat, I found myself reflecting on transformation. 1 year ago, I'd been a widowed accountant, going through motions, serving competently as HOA president but without particular passion or purpose. Mitchell's harassment had forced me to discover capabilities I'd underestimated, to build relationships I'd neglected, to fight battles I'd have preferred avoiding. The experience had been painful, expensive, and exhausting, but it had also been transformative, revealing not just my strength, but the collective power of community members committed to protecting each other. Sometimes, the worst conflicts lead to the best outcomes, not because the conflict itself has value, but because crisis reveals character and creates opportunities for growth that comfort never provides. My Thursday mornings remain peaceful now. I wheel my concrete trash container to the curb without anxiety, exchange friendly waves with neighbors, and appreciate the simple normalcy of routine community life. The container has become such a fixture of neighborhood identity that several residents have joked about trademarking Desert Ridge concrete resistance merchandise. We actually created T-shirts for our anniversary celebration, with proceeds benefiting the Defense Fund. Mine hangs in my closet as a reminder that sometimes the most important battles involve defending the ordinary against those who seek to exploit it. Mitchell chose the wrong community, and definitely chose the wrong HOA president. But in choosing us, he inadvertently created something valuable. A model for community resistance, a network of protected neighborhoods, and proof that bullies eventually encounter immovable obstacles when targets refuse to be moved.